morning.
Good morning.
Nice looking crowd.
Thank you.
Today's sermon on our third principle is my next step in following through on my intention, or threat maybe, to do a series of sermons on each of our 7 principles in turn. Maybe I'll make it all the way through, we'll see. Couple of my usual disclaimers. First, as I've often said before, my only real qualification to speak to you is that I think about stuff a lot, probably more than is healthy, and often from unusual perspectives. I don't pretend to be an expert on anything I'm talking about. This is just one you-use viewpoint. I just hope to give you some things to ponder and to stimulate your own thinking, and maybe have a nice talk back later. Second, my own spiritual development has led me more and more down a Buddhist path, both in practice and in viewpoint. I don't consider this limiting in any way, quite the opposite, but I bring it up just to let you know that I see the world more and more through a Buddhist lens. Once again, I'd like to start by simply going over the principles, which are listed in the front of your hymnal. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And I always have to clarify, it's of which we are a part, not from which we are a part. I have personally found these principles, taken as a group, to constitute a remarkably complete, self-consistent, and interlocking moral code. These principles were agreed upon by our association, not handed down as law by a prophet or a deity. Thus, they constitute a living tradition that we can add to, or clarify, or update as the need arises. We acknowledge a number of sources of our living tradition, which are listed in the hymnal just below the principles, and which I'm not going to read. As Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a creed, but we do have our principles, which are at the core of what it means to be a UU. And while there's plenty of room for interpretation of their meaning, at least according to our congregation's bylaws, a member of our congregation is expected to be in sympathy with these principles. The principles are not a belief system, but a framework around which to build our individual belief systems, or a touchstone against which to test our beliefs. That is, if we find our beliefs to be in conflict with the principles, we probably need to re-examine our belief system. This assertion is going to figure into my exploration today of our third principle, that we affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. It will also be central to a discussion of the fourth principle, but that's for another day, presuming I continue the series. The wording of the principle is a little ambiguous. Does the phrase "in our congregations" apply only to encouragement to spiritual growth, or does it also apply to accept one another? I believe that it was meant to apply to both. Otherwise, encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations and acceptance of one another without that qualification would be two pretty much unrelated concepts that really don't go together as a single principle. So I'm going to assert right up front that the first and second principles are about the respect we should accord to all people, while the third principle is intended to be about how UUs should be in community with each other. What does acceptance mean in this context? I thought that was going to be a simple question to answer. I was wrong. It raised a related question that I thought would be easier to answer. What's the difference between tolerance and acceptance? I was wrong again, but I'll try. Usually we think of tolerance as putting up with something, even if we don't like it or disapprove of it. The something we're putting up with could be a person, a group of people, a belief, an idea, or a situation. We think of acceptance as going a step beyond that to approval of that something. So you can tolerate something without accepting it, but you can't accept it without also tolerating it. So for example, in terms of how a heterosexual person relates to the LGBTQ community, to be tolerant might be to say, I don't care if someone's gay, and as long as they keep it to themselves and don't bother me with it, I won't bother them. But to be accepting is to say discrimination on the basis of sexual or gender orientation is just plain wrong, and I will stand with you or stand up for you against such discrimination. But there's such a wide variation in definitions and usage that tolerance and acceptance are often used almost as synonyms. Acceptance is actually more often used either in the sense of accepting a gift or an offer, or in the sense of resignation to a situation, neither of which we're talking about here, than in the sense of a step beyond just tolerance. Here are two definitions of tolerance from dictionary.com that I think actually connote acceptance in the way we usually think about it. I'm going to read the second one first. A fair, objective, and permissive attitude toward opinions, beliefs, and practices that differ from one's own. Now the first, which I find preferable, a fair, objective, and permissive attitude toward those whose opinions, beliefs, practices, racial or ethnic origins, etc. differ from one's own. Freedom from bigotry. There are two key differences between these definitions. First, there's a perhaps subtle distinction between your attitude toward opinions, beliefs, and practices and toward those who hold them, which suggests that maybe you can accept people who believe differently than you without agreeing that all their beliefs are valid. Second, there's the inclusion of fairness toward those with different racial or ethnic origins, etc. The etc. covers a whole lot of ground here. And the addition of freedom from bigotry. I'm highlighting these distinctions because I don't think it's possible to accept all beliefs as valid, even if we recognize that our own beliefs may not be the best yardstick by which to measure other beliefs. You can't reconcile mutually exclusive beliefs. To accept all beliefs as valid is ultimately to accept no beliefs as valid. But we can certainly respect other people and treat them fairly without bigotry, as the first and second principles call us to do, without agreeing with everything they believe. There is, in my opinion, mistaken notion held by a lot of non-UUs and even some UUs who think that because UUs don't have a creed, and perhaps because we encourage freedom of thought, that UUs can believe anything we want, and that we are obligated to accept all viewpoints as valid. I have a fundamental issue with this notion that I now find, at least according to Wikipedia, was first described by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945 in The Open Society and Its Enemies. And I'm quoting here, "Less well known is the paradox of tolerance. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant." There are counter-arguments to this, and we may indeed tolerate, though not accept, intolerance in the larger society, at least to a point. But my point is that tolerance cannot be absolute. If a UU congregation, in the name of tolerance, accepts those with unapologetically intolerant views into its membership, then it's no longer tolerant, especially if the intolerant become a majority. So if we are to remain a tolerant organization, there must be limits on our tolerance. For beliefs, that is, not for people. I know it's confusing, that's what makes it a paradox. What we need to remember when we talk about a tolerant society or organization is that the society is not an entity unto itself, not some sort of external framework that is imposed on us and controls us, ideally anyway, but rather is simply a collective name for the members who comprise it. A tolerant society can't be comprised of intolerant members. To unwind the paradox a bit, it's not really a paradox to say that we are tolerant of everything but intolerance, because it's really a semantic issue. We're not using tolerance and intolerance as direct antonyms here. The tolerance that we espouse is not tolerance of all beliefs or ideas, but acceptance of and respect for people without regard for their race, ethnicity, national origin, age, gender, sexual orientation, or any of the other categories used to divide us. And what we are intolerant of is not people, but beliefs or ideas that are not compatible with our first or second principles. Granted, it can be challenging to separate intolerance of abhorrent beliefs and ideas from intolerance of the people who hold them. Now, let's get back to the narrower question of what acceptance of one another in our congregations means. Of course, it includes the same freedom from bigotry that we extend to everyone, but I think it goes beyond that. I feel that within our congregations, we are expected to give each other the benefit of the doubt on our beliefs, so long as those beliefs are generally aligned with our UU principles, and to challenge them when we believe they aren't, but I'll mostly save that for the fourth principle talk. Not automatically accept that those beliefs are true or valid, but at least accept that they are sincerely held and entertain the notion that they might be true. We really can't be who we aspire to be as a faith and accept blatantly exclusivist or exclusionary views. But that said, there's always room to be more accepting by being a little more humble about our own notions, by recognizing that we all have different histories, experiences, and perspectives, that we aren't all at the same place, or possibly not as far along on our journeys. If we disagree, it's just maybe possible that it's my view that contains biases that I'm not recognizing. You could be right, or for that matter, we could both be utterly wrong. And even when I don't accept your beliefs in their entirety, and really what two people, especially in a UU congregation, agree on everything, I can still accept that there might be some truth in your beliefs that might help me deepen my own understanding. Indeed, I wouldn't find a group of people who all think alike or believe alike to be very conducive to my spiritual growth. Vive la différence. Excuse my pronunciation. I'm a big fan of syncretism, cobbling together a spiritual system of belief by taking bits of truth from wherever I find them to create my own individual, unique patchwork religion. I'm in full agreement with the notion that there are many paths to the spiritual mountaintop, and that we can switch paths or carve a new one, even, and that we can help each other along even if we're not on exactly the same path. We do have to be cautious not to assume that all paths lead up the mountain. They don't. Just to illustrate that point, I'd like to do something a little different and get you all to help me out and throw in one of my favorite responsive readings here. It's number 657 in your hymnal. It Matters What We Believe by noted Unitarian religious education innovator Sophia Lyon-Foss. I'll read the standard type if you'll read the italicized parts, and I'll give you a moment. 657. You there?
Yeah.
Okay. Some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feeling of being especially privileged.
Other beliefs are expansive and lead the way to wider and deeper sympathies.
Some beliefs are like shadows, clouding children's days with fears of unknown calamities.
Other beliefs are like sunshine, blessing children with the warmth of happiness.
Some beliefs are divisive, separating the saved from the unsaved, friends from enemies.
Other beliefs are bonds in a world community where sincere differences beautify the pattern.
Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own direction.
Other beliefs are like gateways, opening wide vistas for exploration.
Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness.
Other beliefs nurture self-confidence and enrich the feeling of personal worth.
Some beliefs are rigid, like the body of death, impotent in a changing world.
Other beliefs are pliable, like the young sapling, ever growing with the upward thrust of life.
And just to be clear, you ought to aspire to the kind of beliefs that you were reading, not the ones I was reading. Just in case I wasn't clear. Now on to spirituality, a brief little topic in some. I think that to talk about encouragement to spiritual growth, we have to first decide what we mean by spiritual growth. And to do that, we have to decide what we mean by spirituality. Unfortunately, spirituality is an even harder concept to pin down than acceptance. The very first line of the Wikipedia article on spirituality is, "There is no single widely agreed definition of spirituality." No kidding. The article goes on to say, a survey of reviews by McCarroll et al. Dealing with the topic of spirituality gave 27 explicit definitions, among which, quote, "there was little agreement," unquote. Some years ago, here, we rather serendipitously had several nearly consecutive Sunday sermons on the topic of spirituality. Not surprisingly, it turned out to mean completely different things to different people. In our talkback discussion after one of those, we were asked to share what we considered to be spiritual experiences. There were a wide range of examples offered involving art, music, nature, congregational fellowship, religious epiphanies, meditative insights, etc. Finally, one of our members observed that, to her, what these experiences all had in common was that, in one way or another, they involved a feeling of connectedness to something greater than ourselves. I really like that as a general definition and have used it ever since. Spirituality is a sense of connection to a larger whole. It doesn't require a religious or supernatural belief, though it certainly encompasses those. In that view, then, spiritual growth is a process of discovering and deepening your sense of connectedness to humanity, to the earth, to the universe, to a metaphysical or transcendental reality, by whatever path works for you. It need not be tied to a particular religious or supernatural belief, or to any religious or supernatural belief at all. It's possible to develop a deep appreciation of your place in the interdependent web of our seventh principle from a completely secular perspective. With this view of spirituality as connectedness, beliefs or paths that are antithetical to spiritual growth would be those that tend to divide us from each other, thus conflicting with our sixth principle, or those that separate us from the larger reality, thus conflicting with our seventh principle. The nature of spiritual growth in Unitarian Universalism is fundamentally different than in a creedal faith. In a Christian church, for example, spiritual growth might consist primarily of Bible study sessions aimed at deepening one's understanding of the Christian scriptures, or at least of a particular interpretation of them, but is unlikely to include much exploration of other religious traditions. In our tradition, however, we are encouraged to look far and wide to explore those sources listed in our hymnal and anywhere else that there might be a nugget of spiritual truth. We're more about breadth than depth. I've recently come to the realization that I am a UU first, that I view myself as a UU with Buddhist leanings, not as a Buddhist who hangs out in a UU church. I've heard some UUs, I'd have put myself in this category a few years ago, refer to themselves as small c Christians. I think I'm going to start calling myself a small b Buddhist and see if that catches on. One of my favorite things about being a UU has always been that as my spiritual understanding and beliefs grow and change, and they indeed have over the years, I don't have to change my religious affiliation or look for a new spiritual home. I do have to get up and talk about it sometimes. One way we encourage spiritual growth in a UU congregation is simply by providing each other the opportunity to flourish. Another is by sharing our own experiences. Many of us have stood up here and bravely shared our experiences, encouraging others to do the same, and we all learn from each other. We don't tell each other what to believe, we show where we've been and share what works for us or doesn't, in the hope that others might glean something helpful from our experiences. Exposure to many viewpoints, stories, and traditions allows us to compare and contrast, to find connections between different spiritual paths. And we can occasionally help each other avoid wandering astray on paths that, from our own experience, don't lead to the mountaintop. I've always felt that if you have found a path that works for you, the best thing you can do to invite others to share it is to teach by example, not try to tell them what they should do or believe. I find that after 60 plus years on this planet, and about a quarter century as a UU, I've reached a sort of milestone in my own spiritual evolution. It's not that I've stopped growing or ever expect to. A thirst for learning is central to who I am, but I believe I finally found a path that works for me. I'm nowhere near the top of the mountain, but I think I can see it from where I am and keep myself pointed in the right direction. For nearly my entire life, I was a seeker yearning for something that rang true and never quite finding it. There was kind of a quiet desperation to my search. That's gone now. I am at peace with myself and with the universe. This led me to another recent epiphany. Hopefully, I can make this point without sounding too pretentious about it. I don't need the UU Church for my spiritual growth quite as desperately as I did for the first 20 years or so. But I will always remain a UU for many reasons. The two most relevant are, first, that I continue to grow spiritually, and I feel that the experiences and perspectives of other UUs have much to teach me. And second, that now it's time to return the favor, to share my own perspectives, and in so doing, perhaps help a few folks who find themselves in the same sort of spiritual confusion I did 25 years ago, as many people did for me along the way. In other words, I'd stick around even if Unitarian Universalism had nothing more to offer me, because it's my home and I might have something to offer back. Another reason I'll always be a UU is simply that UUs are my kind of people. I'd be bored to tears without you. Which brings me back around to my earlier assertion that what the third principle is about is how we as UUs are to be in community with each other. We're called to accept each other as the beautiful individuals we are and to encourage and support each other in our individual spiritual pathways. We had a discussion group meeting recently for which the opening words, written by retired UU minister Penny Hackett Evans, described UU community beautifully. Each of us brings a separate truth here. We bring the truth of our own life, our own story. We don't come as empty vessels, but rather we come as full people, people who have a story and our own truth. We seek to add to our stories. This room is rich with truth, rich with experience. All manner of people are here, needy, joyful, frightened, anxious, bored, hopefully not too many bored. We all bring our truth with us. May we all recognize the truth in the story in everyone's life. And may we hear and honor the truths that we all bring as we gather together. Together we have truths. Together we have a story. Together we are a community. As a community, a UU congregation isn't some fixed, predefined entity that you agree to conform to when you join. It's a living, changing organism that is defined by its members within the overall framework of our principles And when you join, you're one of those members and you get to help define it. This privilege, of course, comes with some responsibility. As I argued earlier, seemingly paradoxically, we put ourselves forth as a tolerant community. And so we really can't tolerate intolerance within our community. But we also have to approach this lovingly. Not everybody in a UU community is at the same place in their journey or as far along. Not everybody has the same vantage point. The best way we can combat intolerance within our communities is to point it out, not angrily or self-righteously, but lovingly and patiently. And probably more important, do our best to set a good example. Assume that someone who seems intolerant of others has good intentions, but either is unaware of the issue or is doing their best to work on it. Or just perhaps it's our perception of their position that's askew. And be willing to address the hidden biases and blind spots in your own worldview as they come up. We all have them. It comes with being human. To close out, I'd like to summarize my main observations. First, once again, the third principle, that we covenant to affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, tells us how we as UUs should be in relationship, in loving community with each other. Accepting others in this context, to me, doesn't mean that we have to approve of every belief or opinion that they hold, but that we appreciate them for who they are and what they bring to the table, treat them with respect, and welcome them into our community. Second, no, as UUs, we can't believe anything we want, and no, we don't have to accept all viewpoints as valid. There are many spiritual paths and belief systems that are compatible with the UU principles, maybe as many as there are UUs, but importantly, that's not the same as saying that all paths or beliefs are valid. There are indeed many paths that lead up the mountain, but there are a whole lot that don't. The paradox of tolerance points out that if you belong to a group governed by its members, and that group espouses tolerance, then logically you have to espouse tolerance, and your beliefs should be compatible with that. Third, spirituality is hard to pin down, but I define it very generally as anything that makes you feel more connected to something outside yourself. Indeed, anything that blurs the perceived boundary between yourself and everything else. Spiritual growth is anything that moves you closer to that sense of connectedness. Within our congregations, we encourage spiritual growth by sharing our own views and experiences with each other, and by not restricting spiritual exploration to a single direction, for example, to a particular tradition or philosophy or set of scriptures. Finally, as self-governing communities in covenantal relationship with each other and with the UUA, our congregations are what we make them, which is both an opportunity and a responsibility. We're in this together. As a member of such a community, please seek both to learn from other members and to give them the opportunity to learn from you. And as always, life's hard, so help each other through it and try to leave the world at least a little better than you found it. I'm looking forward to talk back. Thanks for listening.